I finally managed to ride out to Guildford and Midland, which are northeast of Perth along the railway line. I had no idea what to expect, and I wasn't sure what was out there, so I hooked up with my mate Rob and let him act as guide. This route is going to be covered in 2 parts, or maybe even 3. This first video will cover riding into the city from Guildford along the shared path that follows the railway line. The second video will cover riding further out to Midland and back. Because we did the first ride out to Guildford partly along the river and partly on suburban roads, I might even do a third video covering those legs. Depends on how much free time I've got over the weekend. I started by taking the long way to the East Perth train station by riding out of the CBD over the Narrows Bridge and then going along the southern side of the Swan River. I did that because it was a nice day and I was early and needed to burn up some time before meeting Rob at 7 AM. I was so early, I ended up riding about 10 kilometres back and forth along the river before heading over to our meeting point in the train station car park. The ride out to Guildford was pretty complicated, and I doubt that I could remember half the turns we made in order to get there. It did involve going down some steps and riding on some dirt tracks and over some bridges, and it was amazing to find that there is a large semi-rural area this close to the CBD. The reason it's like this is that most of the area that we rode through is a floodplain, and we rode past power poles that had signs on them indicating the 100-year flood level. And that was high enough to put a few feet of water through the lounge rooms of the houses on the lower parts if it ever gets really wet. If they can stop property developers from Queensland flying over, it'll probably stay this way. It took about an hour to ride to Guildford via the scenic route, which is why it will get a separate video. Maybe. Although Rob lives in the area and has been out this way many times, he still managed to miss a number of turns and told me that he had no idea for some time that a particular section of path existed until he saw a cyclist exit from it. So I'm not the only one who has found that the wayfinding signage is pretty awful. Because we stayed off the principal shared path for almost the entire trip out to Guildford, I had no idea what to expect when we joined the path back into town after we had breakfast at a cafe. The first thing that struck me was how wide it is. It was almost like a 2-lane road near Guildford train station. It wasn't like this the whole way. This was an anomaly, but it was a good start. It didn't last long. It went back to standard width as soon as we hit the first bridge, which is an old timber bridge that I remembered from my childhood. Before the Great Eastern Highway bypass was built, this road was the main route out of Perth to the east and north, and I always considered Guildford to be where Perth ended and the country began. A whole lot has changed since I was last here about 30 years ago. Not long after crossing the bridge, we hit a section of pink concrete path. Rob told me that this was new, and I couldn't work out why they had used pink concrete instead of the usual red asphalt. Although you could call it red concrete if you like. I guess the local council wanted to be different. It might not have been asphalt, but at least it was, almost the correct colour. And it was well laid and lacking lumpy seams and joints. From there it was a long straight run down the shared path until we got to an area where Rob thought the path was blocked by construction work. Instead of going left across the railway line and then rejoining the shared path on the eastern side of the tracks, we took to the road for a while. Well, actually, we took the road for a long time. There wasn't much traffic, so it wasn't too bad, but I would have preferred to have been back on the shared path. The next few kilometres was pretty confusing as Rob took us on a tour of the back streets of the light industrial area, and I was starting to think that maybe I'm not the only person with a terrible map memory. Somehow we ended up going north instead of southwest and had to mess around a bit to get back on track. Yes, we found ourselves on a bike path, but it turns out it was the wrong bike path. I never expected that to be a problem. If you're used to Sydney, where there are very few bike paths, the idea of the suburbs being crisscrossed by several paths takes a bit of getting used to. Who would have thought that you need to check you're actually on the appropriate path? We eventually rejoined the correct path at Bayswater Railway Station, which is a major construction site at the moment. When I do part 2, I'll show what it's like to take the shared path on the other side of the railway line. Big hint, I think it was much better than the off-road route that we just took. From there, the shared path rolls south for mile after mile with only the odd intersection to contend with. Because it follows the railway line, it's relatively flat for the entire distance. It doesn't exactly follow the grade of the railway line, so it does go up and down a few times, but the inclines are relatively easy and it didn't seem to be giving anyone much difficulty. There are large bike cages at each train station, and I had to wonder why bother riding to the station and parking your bike when there's such a great path running along the train line that will get you into town pretty quickly. Well, I guess the option's there if you prefer to travel that way. As usual, I thought the signage along the way was complete rubbish. That includes the signage on the path letting you know where each exit will take you, as well as signage off the path telling you that the path is there, like just on the other side of that bush, and how to get to it. It's easy to remember where to go after you've done it once, but your first time can be awfully confusing. There'll be more of that in detail in part 2. Getting to the outskirts of the CBD was pretty easy, mainly because I've now been up and down the last section of path at least half a dozen times, so I'm starting to get to know my way around. The only bit I was unsure of was when I got to Barrack Street. Should I turn left at this set of lights or continue straight ahead? I continued on straight ahead and soon found that I'd made a rookie error. Instead of turning left at this point, I should have continued straight ahead and taken a nicely hidden path that every other cyclist in our group knew about. I didn't know it existed until I got around the corner and then noticed the same cyclists coming in from my right. In part 2, I'll show you how well that path is camouflaged. There is no way I would have found it unless there was some other cyclists using it at the same time I was there.